Oh, pardon me. You just interrupted while I was reading a very large book by a famous and world-renowned author. My name is Dr. Jared Champion. I'm here with a new project. This is Champion Writing Works. I'm going to be checking in with you all just about every week. We're going to be walking through a number of different processes and practices that can make your life easier, better. We've got that going for us. So stay tuned, stick around, and let's get to it. I'm here to help. So just know that. This is the start of the 2020 academic year. Nobody knows what's going to happen. We've got a pandemic in the air. Nickelback is still together, so far as I can tell. We are all in very weird places, and with all of that stress compounding on top of everything, we still are going to be tasked with putting together great paper, together a really solid idea. Rigor is going to stay the same. The rest of the college experience is going to be remarkably different. Same terrible food and you have to now eat it at home or in your dorm room where you are socially distanced away from your roommate. You know what I mean? Yep. When you come to me for help, you know you can trust it because I wear a sweater vest. It's basically the equivalent of like a PhD that you can get at Kohl's. So let's start with this. First of all, paper writing. Some people really love it. Some people think, you know what, it gives me time to work on things. It allows me to really think through my ideas and to process and to be clear. And others of us are pretty normal. We're not very excited about paper. This is the start of a series for a method of writing papers that I have perfected, or maybe not perfected, but I've crafted over the course of the last 2 decades teaching college students. For those of you I had 20 years ago, deeply sorry. I didn't know. For those of you that I'll teach in the future, you're welcome. It's a gift. It's a gift. This method that I'm going to teach you will help you to feel more confident and more ready for that paper when the time comes. Well, this is the method that I use to write some of my best papers. You're only getting the good stuff here at Champion Writing Works. Very different than anything you've been taught before, and it's going to help you understand not just how to write a paper, but how I write a paper and why it works this way and why it's so effective. Let's start by thinking through some of the reasons maybe you haven't been so successful writing a paper. It's empty. There's nothing in there. It's a prop, but it makes me look smarter. Am I right? Double props. So smart. Happening right there. Coffee glasses, David Foster Wallace. So smart, right? I know what you're thinking. Because my skull is so strong, it can hold in all that brain matter.
My boy's wicked smart.
Let's start with the first principle. And this one is really key. It hits at the heart of everything that we've done as writers and the reasons methods we've tried before have left us frustrated, angry, and sitting at the computer without anything to say or type. We've all been there. Let's think about some of the things we've done while procrastinating. Purchased a motorcycle, gained a lot of weight, lost a lot of weight, cleaned my house, made it dirty, typed in the wrong password, typed in the right password, typed in all of the passwords, hacked into the Pentagon once, ordered takeout, yelled at the neighbors, had a barbecue with the neighbors. Done a lot of things to procrastinate, all because I had a paper due. Let's talk a little bit about this whole process. First and most important principle, you are not starting with a thesis. Many of us go into classes, get an assignment sheet, look at it, we think through what's my thesis. And the truth is, that's not actually how it works. Way too early in the process. Pause for a minute. Make some distinctions here. Is it true that your thesis needs to be at the front of your paper on the finished product? Absolutely. 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 Is it true that your thesis needs to be at the front of your paper on the finished product? Absolutely. It'd be crazy for me to say otherwise. However, should you have your thesis from the very minute you start the paper? No. In fact, most of the time you're not going to have a thesis at all until much later in the paper process. Oftentimes, almost at the very end of your drafting process, you will find that thesis because you're starting to figure out what it is you're actually trying to argue. You're going to start your paper instead with a question. We're going to hit this and we're going to talk about this a lot in the near future. If you were in the sciences, for example, you would run an experiment and you'd have a hypothesis, that word thesis tucked away in there. See it there? Hypothesis, hypothesis. You can thank me later. Venmo me some cash, whatever. Do it. No, really, do it. Venmo me some money, please. Desperate for snacks, Second major principle of this process, distinction between the product and the process. Really, really essential. If you went to cooking school, they wouldn't tell you to go bring a cake in and then build the cake. So think about your thesis a little bit like the cake, that you have to put a lot of things together, process a lot of instruction, work your way through to get to the point where you actually have a cake. It's sort of silly to think that a student would start a paper and know this great argument, this great interpretation. It's not necessary. So we're not going to start with that. Your thesis is important. It is the end result of your paper. It is not the starting point of your paper. So make sure you think about that division between process and product. Argument in the academic setting is not the same thing that you probably have experienced with your siblings, for example, or maybe your partners. It's not the same as that. Instead, think of an academic argument as a supported interpretation. In the academic world, when we say argument, we do not mean fight. In the academic world, when we say argument, we do not mean fight. Those are not the same. Academic arguments are different. They're not even confrontational oftentimes. In fact, in an academic argument, you can argue with someone by saying, look, I think you're right. In fact, I think you're so right, we could make you even righter by moving our way forward and building on what you've said here, here, and here. You don't need to go into a lot of detail about somebody being wrong about everything. In fact, there are a dozen different reasons that's not necessarily a great idea. There are 1,000 reasons that's not a great idea. We'll get into this in some of the later videos in the series, but for right now, I want you to think about an argument, an academic argument, not as a fight.
I broke my back.
Instead, I want you to think of it as a supported interpretation. You are going to support your interpretation or support your answer in some way, shape, or form. This is pretty important for you to understand the bigger vibe, the path that I'm sending you on. We're not starting with a thesis, and instead we're going to actually start with a great question. We're going to call this one of two things. We're going to call it either the problem statement or the central question. And in the paper itself, it will play a heavy role later on when we start writing that introduction. But for right now, what you need to know is that your central question is the question you seek to answer through your paper. It can take a lot of different forms. If you're in an English class, it could sound something like this. If you're interested in questions of race, you could say, how does Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man connect ideas of labor with notions of race? What about race and gender? What about race and sexuality? There are a lot of different ways that you can go about building these. I've got a little link that I'm going to put in the description here with a sort of template for coming up with great central questions. It's sort of like a Mad Lib, super nerdy, not the kind of thing you're going to want to do on a Friday night unless you're trying to write a paper on a Friday night, in which case, what's wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Relax a little bit. It's going to be all right. Follow this process. You're going to get through it. So you're going to start with this great central question. A great question leads to great papers, but you don't want to start anything until you're sure about that question. Let's talk a little bit about why you want to start with a question and what the ethical implications are. That's right, I said ethical. I'm smart like that. Glasses on. So the ethics of the situation. Let's think about it for a minute. If you start a paper with the conclusion and you are going to set out to prove that you're right over and over and over again, you might even write a paper where every paragraph opens with some variation of the sentence, another reason I'm right about this is blank. You might go through the whole paper for 12, 15, 20 pages trying to show us how right you are again and again and again and again, again and again and again and again, again and again and again and again. It's not great. In fact, if you start with that answer, you'll end up halfway through the paper and you'll find some pesky detail. It's going to complicate everything and you're going to think everything is over and you have to scrap the paper. Even worse, many times what happens is students start with a thesis, start writing their I'm right paper, I'm right again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and then they produce this paper which never really digs for depth. It only proves their thesis right over and over and over and over again. I have a dog. She's right here. She wants some attention. And you'll show the person why you're right 1,000 times over, but you'll have hidden those details or you'll have ignored those pieces of evidence that complicate what it is you're trying to say. However, if you start with a question, a good question, your job is simply to answer that question and show us why the answer to that question is complicated. We'll get into that quite a bit more in later videos, but know that the best place you can start is with a great question, because the answer to that great question is going to be a great thesis. Let me repeat repeat that for you. This one is really important. Arguably more important than knowing that Taco Bell's fourth meal is available late. So you're going to want to pay attention. The answer to your central question is your thesis. They're related. You don't need that thesis just yet. All you need is to know what the great question is. Figure out what your question is. You can use your assignment sheet to figure this out. You can use office hours with your professor to figure it out. You can start looking in and thinking about things that you find personally interesting or personally important. All of these are great routes to go. Let's take a look here at the computer, and I'm going to walk you through the construction of a handful of really great central questions. I want to talk you through a few basic principles that will help you to understand a little more about what makes a great central question. The first, of course, is that it needs to be open-ended. You can't answer these with yes or no. This is pretty easy to deal with, generally speaking. Consider adding the word how to the beginning of the sentence. For example, if you say something like, does John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath address gender? The answer is obviously going to be yes. That's not a great paper. However, if you say, how does John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath address gender? That's a good question. Number two, it's going to require analysis to answer. It's going to ask you to use those details to piece together an analytic paper that will answer that question. So it's going to require analysis to answer. It's going to require evidence from your exhibit to answer the question completely. You'll notice here that I've highlighted exhibit both times in blue, and that's because I'm using this word exhibit to reflect what we would know generally as a primary source, but in this case, I want you to think of exhibit a little more broadly. I want you to think of the exhibit material as whatever it is you're studying. This is really important, particularly if you're working outside of the humanities. You'll want to ask, what exactly are you studying? Whatever that is you're studying, that's your exhibit. Your exhibit is wherever you're pulling that evidence. You want to be very careful about the question that you're asking. If the question is about, say, the world, then you're setting yourself up for a really difficult paper. For example, if you say something like, does Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath reflect American gender politics? That's a possible paper if you're asking about culture, but you're probably trying to ask a question about the book itself. If that's the case, you want to ask the question in such a way that it's only about the book itself. And then finally, the answer would add to the reader's understanding of the exhibit material. When you're thinking about the reader, remember that there are actual scholars working in every different field, every different area, every discipline. Think of specifically who exactly would read this paper and what would he or she have to learn from this question if it were answered. That's really big. It can be as simple as you doing a quick Google search to find out the scholars or professors who are working on this question and really look them up. Find somebody that you can actually picture and say, I know exactly what Dr. Champion would want to know about this stand-up special, or I know what Dr. Smith would want to know about climate change and the environment. Whatever that question is, you want to make sure that you can picture an audience for that. The best way you can figure out your audience, look to the works cited pages of people who are writing on this field. That's your audience, people who are studying this field. This is the Mad Lib. This is the sort of format that I offer to my students, and this is the same thing that I use in my own research. We have two different versions of Mad Lib style questions. How does blank shape meaning in blank? And then the second question is the ampersand question. So let me put an ampersand right in there to highlight. How do blank and blank interact in blank? And to fill in those A spots, you can pick any of these different categories. This is particularly true in the humanities. If you're working in the sciences, you may need to generate a different list, but talk to your professors and say, I'm looking for a great question that I can answer by doing my research. And this is the type of bullet point list you want to generate so that you can figure out exactly where your interests lie and where you can start to piece together the puzzle. Notice here as well that I offer this ampersand as an option to really complicate those questions for the texts that have been studied quite a bit. If your job is to add to the reader's understanding, consider for a minute that people are still writing about Shakespeare and he was alive some bajillion years ago. How are scholars still able to add to the reader's understanding by studying Shakespeare? By narrowing their topic. It's counterintuitive, but the narrower you can be with your question, the better off you will be when you're trying to answer it and add to the reader's understanding. I want to highlight my favorite piece of this whole process and ultimately set your mind at ease, because I know for many of you, you're probably thinking, Champion, what are you doing to me here? I've started every paper my whole entire life with a thesis, and now you come right out of the gate swinging hard saying no more thesis at the start of the paper. How on earth am I supposed to write this paper and have a great thesis? The answer to your question is going to be your thesis. For example, in my dissertation, I asked the question, how does labor and manhood interact to
create and shape meaning in Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. When I answer that question, I turn it from a question into an answer. It becomes my new thesis. So labor and manhood interact to create and shape meaning in Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath by blank. Whatever I find that answer to be when I study the material, that's going to be a really dynamite thesis, clear and concise. And it's just as simple as knowing that eventually I'll find the answer to that, but I don't need it on the front end. I will find that as I go through and study and analyze the material. So rest assured that this process will ultimately lead you to a great thesis, but you don't need it on the front end. I just need you to trust me for a little bit and know that we will get there. We will find your thesis. You will be okay. You will make it through the semester, and we'll all be all right.
We're talking about things like thesis statements, arguments, evidence, and we're looking at that evidence and we're starting to process it. That's ultimately what we're dealing with when we think about a really great paper. You're looking at the evidence, you're analyzing it, you're interpreting it, and ultimately at the end, you're trying to tell a story of how all of those pieces fit together to create the answer to your central question. A parallel that we see in regular life is the legal system. We have officers or investigators who go into a crime scene and they go Dexter style. They take photos of everything. They look for all of the possible evidence, and then they give this big box. We've all seen it. The box of evidence that we've seen on every TV show or movie ever, where they take that file box and give it over to an attorney, which is eventually going to be a cold case because they don't know what they're doing any more than we do, right? So they take this giant box and they pass it to an attorney. Well, that box is your evidence. It's whatever it is you're writing about. So if you're writing about the Grapes of Wrath, that box is the novel The Grapes of Wrath. So when this attorney, when she looks into this box, do you want that attorney to know exactly what they think happened and then set out to prove that that's right? That's what we call confirmation bias. It's not great. It's not a good look, and it leads to a lot of problems. If that attorney instead starts with a question, and that question could be as simple as, what happened? If that attorney goes at it and starts with a great question, what happened? Then that's going to spark a number of other smaller questions that she's going to have to answer before presenting the case. And that's where we are in this process. Instead of starting with the court case, which is effectively the idea of starting with your thesis at the front end of the project, instead we're going to start with that question. So instead of starting with your court case already built and then trying to find and cherry pick details to support the answer that you want to be true, a completely unethical process by way of writing a paper because it leads to confirmation bias, we're going to instead back up a little bit and we're just going to ask that great question. So we're going to build a great question, we're going to start there, and we're going to work from that question. So on this list that we put together a little while ago, I showed you a number of different ways to go about putting together a really great central question. Your job in a great paper is to add to the reader's understanding of that topic. Here's my favorite piece of it. One of the best things that you can do to set yourself apart is by answering a question that is a good question nobody else has answered. By setting yourself up to answer a great question, you're going to set yourself apart from your peers who are going to take the obvious route. What are those obvious routes? Well, in the humanities, it's fairly easy. Think about the obvious question. If you're reading Virginia Woolf, everybody is going to write about gender in Virginia Woolf. It's an interesting enough topic, but it's been done 1,000 times over. I don't want to read that paper any more than you want to write that paper. However, one of the best things you can use is this little guy here, an ampersand. Put a little ampersand in that question and suddenly it becomes much better. Instead of asking, how does Virginia Woolf deal with gender in Mrs. Dalloway? You can instead say, how does Virginia Woolf integrate notions of gender with ideas of labor? What about money? What about race? What about space? What about place? What about a million different things that you can add to it? So all of your peers who write the same tired paper about Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway, they're going to turn in something that looks basically the same with the same tired ideas. But you, my friend, you're going to turn in the ampersand question. And that question is going to be, how does Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf connect ideas of blank and gender? Well, that's it, everybody. That's the start of my paper writing process. Shoot me a message or comment below and tell me the types of questions you might have. Once again, this is Jared Champion with Champion Writing Works. I hope that you'll like and subscribe, and I hope you'll join me again next week when I talk to you about how to use these central questions to build a great database of evidence for writing your final paper. Like and subscribe so that you can stay up to date on all of these videos as we go through the paper writing process through the course of this semester. This is Jared Champion with Champion Writing Works. I'm here to help. Remember, blah, blah, blah.